Are you an old I'm sorry, I mean a mature person? Well, that depends. Our concept of old really has to do with how old we are. Now, if you compare yourself to someone in the year 1000, you might really be old. People are living much longer in the 21st century than they ever did in history. Back in the year 1000, you would be lucky to blow out 30 candles on your birthday cake. Imagine all the civilizations and conquest and inventions you would have to make before you take a dirt nap. Now, to be honest, these are estimates and averages, so there had to be someone around that was really old, like 40. Really though, if you could avoid dying as a young child due to disease, malnutrition, or being bitten in half by a large predator, you could possibly live to your 40s or maybe even your 50s. But that was about it. We're going to take a quick look at the average life expectancy through the years, what made it go up, and how we can keep it moving in the right direction. Because there's a certain major nation whose population arrow is pointing in the wrong direction right now. I'll try to make it flashy and splashy, but these are facts and figures. Geeks like me love stats and maps. This is the one with numbers. If you hang around to the end, you'll find some really surprising stats you won't believe. Until recently, we didn't know too much about how long cavemen and women lived. There are several new ways now that researchers are able to accurately age fossils. And these new methods now suggest the average Neolithic age human bought the farm at a maximum of 33 years. And as time went on, the age would slowly creep upward to about 38 years during the Bronze Age. That lasted till about 1200 BC. Then something cataclysmic happened to cause the number to go down, and not up. Actually, it was several factors that would give the ancient Greeks a shorter life than the average Mesopotamian. One reason was disease. Serious outbreaks of malaria, tuberculosis, and various plagues would sweep across the world. And since no one understood anything about germs, it didn't stop until it ran out of victims. Poor or non-existent sanitation was another reason, along with famine, which could be extra devastating in prehistory. And then there were the wars. Ancient Greeks had anger management issues, and they loved to wage war, and it had an effect. As a result, the average Greek in 500 BC would bite the dust younger than someone who had lived several hundred years before. Fast forward to the year 1000 AD. That's 1500 years later. The era of Roman domination had come and gone, and the average age of someone in the early days of the second millennia was slowly starting to rise. By the year 1000, we were up to 31. The future was so bright we had to wear shades, which were super fashionable. That is until the Black Death, or bubonic plague, swept across the globe. That was a tough one for humankind. It would take another 500 years before the numbers would go up enough to notice. Which brings us to about the year 1500. Just a couple of years after you-know-who sailed the ocean blue, and there were lots of other famous explorers searching the New World for anything they could plunder. And one thing that was truly priceless, the Fountain of Youth. In the year 1500, we were still behind the average life expectancy of a Bronze Age dude, which means in the late medieval period, you could expect to kick the bucket by the time you were 40. But Juan Ponce de Leon had the idea there was a fountain of youth, and he was determined to find it. He made 2 voyages to the area he named Florida. He finally narrowed it down to Bimini, a small island in the Bahamas. So he returned a few years later in 1521 with the idea of establishing a colony there. But the local yokels had other plans, and Ponce de Leon was driven away with spears and arrows. He died from his wounds just a little later in Havana, at the fairly ripe age of 47. But there really is an island called Bimini, and it's really famous. And there is a place that's supposed to be the fountain that Ponce de Leon was looking for. It's called the Healing Hole. It's located in a deep mangrove swamp. There are no roads that lead there. You can only reach it by boat, piloted by an experienced local. It's just a short cruise from Astound. There's a spring in the middle of the swamp. The water there is fresh but heavy with minerals. And that's what makes it so special. That means the locals on Bimini should be really old, right? Well, no. Today, the average life expectancy for females is 76, and for men it's only 71. That's low by current world standards. So I guess it's safe to say if there is a fountain of youth, this ain't it. But there are other places around the world that claim they have special waters, such as the springs in Lourdes in France, blessed by the spirit of the Virgin Mary. Water from the Dead Sea is said to have therapeutic properties due to its very high mineral content and almost no life. Yakushima Island in Japan is known for its primal ancient rainforest. It's said Yakushima has the perfect serenity, unlike anywhere else on the earth, and its calming natural beauty has a restorative effect. We feel more relaxed already. Warm Springs, Georgia in the United States is known for their healing properties. The warm water stays at a constant 88 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 21 degrees Celsius. It's interesting, the water contains various minerals that could hurt you in large quantities, including calcium, magnesium, silica, barium, cadmium, manganese, sodium, phosphorus, silicon, titanium, and zinc. But in this form, they're good for you. The springs became famous thanks to President Franklin Roosevelt, who visited them often for relief from polio. He actually died there in 1945. And there are lots of others all over the world. But now let's get back to our timeline. We were up to the year 1521, when Ponce de Leon met his maker. During this period, we would see the rise of a more modern civilization, and the influence of Great Britain especially. By the late 1700s, the English and some other countries were putting 50 candles on their cakes. That's a pretty big jump, but it happened over 3 centuries. Also remember, these are average upper numbers for age. There's a huge difference between the death ages of the rich and the poor, and it's still that way today, as we'll see in a minute. The industrial age really started revving up around the late 1700s, just about the same time a little upstart of a country that called itself the United States of America was coming into being. It looked like things would just continue to improve, but the 1800s were a very difficult century. The average age during the first half of the century actually went down due to several serious conflicts, like the War of 1812, the Napoleonic Wars, and the Civil War, plus serious diseases, despite advances in medical technology, because those doctor tools really didn't start to kick in until the early 20th century. But things have improved. From the mid-1800s onward, the average age a person could expect to live has doubled every 10 generations. Now that's amazing. It's thanks to improved education, healthcare, sanitation, clean water, and better nutrition. In the early 20th century, we can see that exponential population growth, according to numbers from the U.S. Social Security Administration, as the average age crept upward every decade. Now, when we average the male and female numbers together, we find we're up to 51.8 by 1910, 58 years by 1920, 68 years in 1950, and it keeps going up from there. In 1960, we're up to 69.9. In 1970, it's 71 years. Now that's 67.1 for men, almost 75 for women. In 1980, we're up to 73.7, and 1990, 75.3. Now this was the first year the average life expectancy for men went over 70 years, but women were closing in on 80. In the year 2000, it's up to 76.71, and in the year 2010, 77.6. Now, women would cross the 80-year mark the next year in 2011. Now, instead of 2020, let's just do 2019. The reasons will be clear in just a minute. According to SSA.gov, in 2019, men lived to an average of 76.3, and women were cruising right along at 80.7 years old. That's an average of 78.5. Then the pandemic swept across the world. PBS tells us before any vaccines were developed, COVID would erase almost 2 years from the average American's life. That seems like a small amount, but it can take decades to recover. There were nearly 529,000 more deaths in the first year of the pandemic compared to 2019. There is a bright spot, though. While COVID is still around, it's not the major killer it once was. And the really good news is infant mortality rates are still going down. So even though adults may have lost a couple of years overall, our newest family members will continue to live longer lives than we do. And if you live in one of these countries to the left of this graph, your life continues to lengthen. But notice the line that represents the U.S., it's not all tangled up with all the others. It's going in the wrong direction, and we're not the only one. It seems several larger wealthy nations have this issue lately. A lot of the decline can be blamed on COVID, but not all. For people living in the United States, the life expectancy went down between 2019 and 2021, dropping to 77.4 today. Russia likewise has seen a drop of almost 2 years, from 73.3 to 71.5 today. Brazil took almost 3 years off their age, which is now 76.7. And Mexico, life expectancy has been dropping due to something besides the pandemic. Macro Trends reports unhealthy lifestyles, violent crime, and chronic illness are the reasons life expectancy in Mexico is now down to 75.5 years. And if you're able to live to a ripe old age, you gotta be born first. I wonder how the countries with the highest birth rates do in the longevity department. How many years can they expect to live? Take a look at this chart. It's interesting. Niger, with 46.86 births per 1,000 population, leads the world in fertility, but their average life expectancy is only 64.2 years. And take a look at the rest of these too. It's interesting, all the countries that make the most babies overall seem to live the shortest lives, mostly due to poor hygiene and lots of conflict and violence. Every single one of these countries is in Africa. But what about the big boys, the most populous nations? How do they do? Well, the most populated countries have slowed down on the baby making, as you can see here. And here's another stat that China just took over from the US. The Chinese now live about 2 months longer than the average American. But they're not making a lot of babies, as you can see by this list. And now let's take one more look at the demographics and see the median ages of each of these 10 nations. And would you look at that? What a huge difference! India's median age is 28.2 years, while the United States is 38.9, but look at Russia, 39.2. Now let's compare that to the median ages of the 10 countries with the highest birth rates. It's night and day. It's a completely different situation. In Niger, half the people are younger than 15.2 years. These numbers are truly mind-blowing. What do you think it means? The largest countries aren't growing as quickly as these younger, mostly African nations. The demographics of the world will look vastly different in just a couple of decades. So now you know how long you can reasonably expect to live. As long as you take good care of yourself, don't act a fool, and stay off of hot air balloons, submarines, or motorcycles. Oh, and don't binge drink or do illicit substances. If you behave yourself, you should live to a ripe old age. And when you do, be sure to come back and give us a like. Hey, thanks for watching. This is Get Details, what you need to know. Made by humans like me, for real people like you. And be sure to check out our other almost informative videos.